They laughed at me for years because of my weight, my family, my classmates, my city, and 10 years later, I walked a runway in the same town that made me cry, and every single one of them was watching. This is the story of what I did with all that pain. My name is Maya Brooks. My earliest memory isn't a birthday or a Christmas morning, it's a memory from second grade. A boy named Marcus pointed at me on the playground and said, loud enough for everyone within 10 feet to hear, "Why is she so big?" I remember looking down at my shoes. Pink light-up sneakers. I stared at the blinking lights and willed myself somewhere else. That was the beginning. I grew up in Miami, in a house where the AC ran year-round and rice and peas appeared on the table at least 4 nights a week, and where love was real but complicated, and where I spent the better part of my childhood learning what it felt like to be the most visible person in any room, for all the wrong reasons. We were a big family, not just big in personality, big in body. My mother Gina wore her curves with a kind of quiet dignity she'd spent decades earning. My father Ray had the kind of solid, broad-shouldered build that men in his generation called being built. Even my brother Jerry, 2 years younger than me, carried some extra weight when we were kids, but Jerry found football in middle school, and the weight came off him like he'd just been waiting for the right excuse. After that, he was tall and lean, and suddenly one of the popular ones. I watched that transformation from across the dinner table and felt something that I still don't have a clean word for. Not jealousy, exactly. Something more like grief. Because I didn't have a sport to save me. I didn't have an escape hatch. What I had was my sketchbook and a pencil and a brain that couldn't stop seeing things in shapes and fabric and color. What I had was an imagination that kept me company when nothing else would. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The teasing started in elementary school and never really stopped. It just changed voices. Kids on the playground, then kids in the hallways, then my own brother. Jerry, my brother, was 2 years behind me in school, which meant our paths crossed in the hallway maybe twice a day in middle school. I learned quickly not to look for him. The few times I did, hoping for something, a nod, a hey, I got nothing. He'd be mid-laugh with his football friends, and he would look right through me like I was a stranger, like I was wallpaper. At home, it was different. At home, Jerry had opinions. "Maya, you ate the last of the plantains again?" he'd say, loud whenever my parents were in earshot. Once, when I was in 8th grade, I was wearing a dress I had actually made myself, a yellow cotton wrap dress with a little ruffle at the hem that I was genuinely proud of, and Jerry looked me up and down in the kitchen and said, "You look like a banana." Then he laughed at his own joke and grabbed his backpack and walked out the door. My mother said, "Jerry." Just that. One word, and not even a sharp one. I went upstairs and changed. I never wore the yellow dress again. I gave it away the following month to a donation bin and didn't think about it again for a long time. Or I told myself I didn't. My parents, and I want to be careful here because I know they loved me. I know it in the way you know things that are complicated and true at the same time. My parents had a habit that I think they believed was encouragement. My mom, Gina, would cup my face in her hands sometimes, and she'd say it with so much warmth it almost disguised the wound inside it. "You have such a pretty face, baby, if you could just lose a little weight." My dad, Ray, would nod from behind his newspaper. Their logic, when they laid it out, was practical. "We're already married. We're already grown. You're young, Maya. You have your whole life ahead of you. A man wants to see effort. An employer wants to see effort." What they meant was, your face is an asset, but your body is a liability, and the world will evaluate you on both. They weren't wrong about the world. The world is exactly that unkind. But hearing it from the people who were supposed to be your safe place, that lands differently. That sticks to your ribs. I tried the diets. Lord knows I tried. I tried the one where you cut out all white foods. I tried the shake program my aunt was selling out of her trunk that one summer. I tried cutting carbs, then cutting sugar, then just cutting everything until I was dizzy by noon and miserable by dinner and back to normal eating by the end of the week. Nothing stuck. Nothing transformed me into a version of myself that the world would receive more kindly. What stuck was the drawing. From as early as I can remember, I was drawing clothes. Not just clothes, fashion, structured shoulders on a coat, the way a skirt could move if you cut it on the bias, necklines and hemlines and the exact drape of a wide sleeve. I filled notebooks. I filled the backs of homework assignments. I filled the margins of church bulletins when I was supposed to be paying attention to the sermon. My teachers would see me doodling and assume I was checked out. I was more checked in than I had ever been in my life. I just wasn't checked into the lesson. By 9th grade, my mother, in one of those gestures of love that I didn't fully appreciate at the time, bought me a sewing machine. A decent one, a brother, nothing fancy, but it worked. She set it up in the corner of my room and said, "If you're going to draw all these dresses, you might as well learn to make them." I think she thought it would be a phase, something that would hold my attention for a month and collect dust by Christmas. She underestimated me. Everybody did. That was their first mistake. The sewing was hard at first. The gap between what I saw in my mind and what emerged from the sewing machine was humbling. Seams puckered, hems dipped, zippers fought me every single time. But I kept going because I had nowhere else to put all the feeling I was carrying, and when I was at that machine, I was fully in charge of something. I could see the problem. I could fix the problem. Nobody was laughing at me while I was sewing. It was just me and the fabric and the whir of the motor, and in that corner of my room, I was not too big for anything. Word got around the way things do in high school when you're actually good at something that other girls want. First, it was a friend of a friend who needed something for a quinceañera and couldn't find it in a store. Then it was a girl 2 grades above me who wanted a prom dress that nobody else would have. Then it was graduation dresses, birthday dresses, homecoming. I made a design book, a real one, with hand-drawn illustrations and fabric swatches clipped to the pages, and girls would flip through it like it was a catalog. I started charging $30, then $50, then $80. By the end of 10th grade, I had charged a girl $120 for a beaded gown, and she had cried when she put it on, and the look on her face was the most satisfied I had felt in recent memory. I put every dollar into an account I called, in my head, my escape fund. My mother didn't know the name I'd given it, but I think she understood, on some level, what it was for. I also kept a calculator. A small one, nothing digital, just a calculator I kept in the front pocket of my backpack. And on it I tracked a number that I updated every morning before school, the number of days until I could leave Miami. I had started the counting in the middle of 10th grade, after one specific incident that I will tell you about now, because it is the kind of thing that either breaks you or clarifies you, and it did both to me before it finally settled into the second one. Physical education at my high school was required through 10th grade, 2 years of it, mandatory, non-negotiable. I had survived 9th grade by keeping to the back, staying quiet, doing enough to pass, and not a fraction more. But in 10th grade, we had Miss Robinson, and Miss Robinson did not believe in the back. It was a Friday in April. The sky was high and blue, and the sun had that particular Miami intensity that makes the air feel thick. We were outside on the large field. The whole class of girls, maybe 25 of us, assembled at the starting line. 2 laps of the field, approximately 880 yards. You ran it or you walked it, but you finished it. I remember looking at the field and doing a quiet internal calculation. I knew, with the certainty of someone who knows exactly what her body can and cannot do, that this was going to be a long day. The whistle blew. They took off. All of them, even the girls who were not athletic, even the ones who usually complained, they took off with the instinctive propulsion of people who had simply never thought about running as anything other than a thing bodies did. I started moving. I had decided I would try to run, at least at the beginning. I made it maybe 100 yards before my lungs began their protest, before my legs remembered that they had not signed up for this, before the heat pressed down on my shoulders like something intentional. I slowed to a walk. I watched the lead girls pull farther and farther ahead. I watched the middle of the pack thin out as the faster ones lapped the slower ones. I kept moving, 1 foot in front of the other, 1 foot in front of the other. By the time I reached the halfway point of my first lap, the fastest girls had already finished both of theirs. They were standing at the end of the field, some bent forward with hands on knees, some standing upright, all catching their breath. And then they caught something else. Me. Still on my first lap, still walking, still 100 yards at least from the point where they had already finished. I saw them talking. I saw the gestures, the way a hand lifts to point, the way a group of girls sort themselves around a shared target. I kept walking. I saw Miss Robinson glance at her stopwatch. I saw the expression on her face, not cruel, just removed. The way someone looks when they have a schedule and something is disrupting it. I finished the first lap. I started the second. My legs were lead. My lungs were fire. The sun had not moved, had no intention of moving, sat exactly overhead and reminded me of every reason I had ever had to be ashamed of taking up space. The last 50 yards, I am almost certain I was not running, was not walking, was doing something in between that has no word in English. A shuffle, a survival. I could hear the sounds from the edge of the field, the murmurs that were loud enough to be intentional, the particular quality of a laugh that is aimed at something specific. I finished. I stood at the end of the field with my hands on my knees, and I breathed, and I did not cry, and that cost me something, not crying. I used up a reserve of dignity that I did not have a lot of. Miss Robinson had the class move on to agility drills. I waited until the other girls were engaged, and I walked to where she was standing and I said, quietly, that I didn't think I could continue. She looked at me, actually looked at me, not through me. And she said, "Go sit on the bench." I sat on that bench, and I watched the rest of class through a kind of blurred underwater lens. The locker room afterward was slow. My arms and legs had gone the consistency of wet sand. It took twice the time it normally takes to change and put on my regular clothes, sitting on the bench between each piece of clothing because standing required a decision I wasn't sure I could make. I was late to 6th period. My teacher gave me an unexcused tardy and didn't push it further. I was average, attendance-wise and grade-wise, and sometimes being invisible is a mercy. It was a Friday, and thank God it was a Friday. I spent the entire weekend horizontal. I recounted the whole thing to Deja on the phone Saturday night. Deja, who had been my best friend since 3rd grade, who was the one consistent soft place in my life. And she said all the right things, the commiserating sounds, the "that's awful, they're terrible, you did it though, you finished it." And she was right that I finished it. I held on to that. But Monday came, the way Monday always comes, and I walked into school with the acute full-body awareness of someone who believes everyone is looking. I know they weren't. Most teenagers are too consumed with their own survival to spend more than a few minutes on someone else's, but the feeling was real even when the data didn't support it. And then there was Beth. Beth Callahan sat 2 rows behind me in English and had a talent for making her cruelty look like commentary. She was the kind of pretty that Miami produces in quantity: highlighted hair, good skin, the easy confidence of someone who had never once stood at a starting line and calculated the odds against her. The first time Beth came for me directly, it was in the locker room before PE. She didn't do it loudly. She came and stood near me while I was tying my shoes and said, low enough that it was technically just between us, "I don't know why you even bother with the laps. You know it just makes it worse, right? The bouncing." She said it with an almost sympathetic face, then she walked away. I sat there for a moment with one shoelace in each hand, and I understood with total clarity what she was. She wasn't careless about it. She was precise. That was worse. The second time was public, and therefore worse in a different way. We were in the cafeteria, junior year. I had survived 10th grade PE by then, had earned my way out of it, and this is a separate story. But Beth had an audience that day, 4 girls at her table, and when I walked by with my tray, she said, to the table but audible to anyone within a 6-foot radius, "The fashion designer." And she made a specific face that took the words and turned them into something that meant the opposite. The girls at her table did what girls at tables do. They laughed, that particular quiet laugh that travels exactly as far as it needs to. One of them glanced at me and then glanced away, like I wasn't worth the full second. Another one whispered something and covered her mouth with her hand. It was choreography they had practiced without ever rehearsing. The laughter was soft, and it was aimed, and it followed me the full length of the cafeteria. I kept my face neutral and my pace steady, but something in my chest went tight and stayed that way for the rest of the day. That kind of thing doesn't hurt like a slap, it hurts like a slow leak. You don't notice how much air you've lost until you're already flat. I sat down and opened my lunch and stared at it. I did not let my face do anything. I was not hungry anymore. I was 17 years old, and I was so tired of taking up space in rooms that had already decided what I was worth. But I filed it away. I added it to the ledger I was keeping, not of grievances exactly, but of reasons. Every reason became fuel. Every laugh became jet fuel. I was building a fire that would eventually get me the heck out of Miami. After that Friday in PE, I added a second countdown to my calculator. This one was not days until I could leave Miami. This one was smaller, more immediate, more survivable. 92 days until the end of the semester. Until I had completed my physical education requirement. Until no one could make me stand at a starting line again and perform my own humiliation for an audience. 92 days, I checked that number every morning. I got through the rest of 10th grade by being unremarkable in PE and exceptional everywhere else. I turned in sewing jobs. I saved money. I went to the guidance counselor, Mrs. Pettiford, starting early in 11th grade, and I became what I can only describe as a regular nuisance in the best possible sense. I was in her office with a question or a form every other week. What scholarships were available to Florida residents? What scholarships were there for arts students? What scholarships didn't require a specific GPA minimum? What did my application essay need to say? Mrs. Pettiford was a small woman with large reading glasses who smelled like the same lotion every day, and she treated me with a matter-of-factness that I came to deeply appreciate. She didn't pity me. She just helped me work the problem. She pointed me toward grants and local foundations and national programs for students in design. I applied to everything that even tangentially applied to me. I applied for fashion programs outside of Florida, which had been my hard requirement from the moment I started the countdown. Not Florida, anywhere but Florida. Somewhere cold, if possible. Somewhere with seasons and possibility and distance from everything I had been told I was. My parents wanted me in a business program. Something practical. They loved me the way people love you when they're afraid for you, which meant they sometimes said things that sounded like limits. Fashion, Maya. How many people actually make it in fashion? What happens when the little side business doesn't work out? I listened. I nodded. I kept applying. I got into Bergen Community College in New Jersey. Fashion Design Associate's degree program. 2 years. Manageable debt. 20 miles from New York City. 20 miles from New York City. I read that line in the brochure 3 times. My parents were not enthusiastic. Dad said it wasn't a real career path. Mom said at least it wasn't all the way across the country. Jerry said, at dinner the night I told them, "You're going to New York to sell clothes? Good luck with that," and then went back to his phone. I smiled. I was smiling at the calculator number in my head, not at him. The day I graduated high school was the happiest day of my life up to that point. I wore a dress I had made, a structured royal blue sheath with hidden pockets and a neckline I had drafted 7 times before it was right. And I walked across the stage in the Miami heat and I let myself feel it. The joy that had been waiting behind the countdown. The arrival of the number I had been subtracting toward for years. 0. College didn't start until August. I didn't wait. I used my escape fund. I moved to New Jersey in June. I rented a room from a woman named Mrs. Adebayo who had 2 cats and made jollof rice on Sundays and did not ask me too many questions. I got a weekend job at a coffee shop in Hackensack. On the other 5 days, I did what I had been dreaming of since I first found a subway map in a library book. I went to New York City. I went every chance I got. Sometimes with a destination, sometimes with nothing but a subway card and the intention to walk until I understood something. I found the fashion district. I stood outside buildings and learned their addresses. I walked into fabric shops on 39th Street and ran bolts of fabric through my hands and stored away the prices and the feel of the materials. I ate dollar pizza and watched people and sketched on napkins and was more alive than I had been in 18 years of living. By August, I knew those streets the way you know something you have earned. Bergen Community College was nothing like I expected in the ways that mattered most. On the first day, I looked around the classroom the way I had always done. the habitual scan of any new environment to assess the threat level, to find out early what kind of loneliness I was in for. My classmates were not who I expected. Most were in their late 30s and 40s. Some were in their 50s. They were people who had waited until they could afford to do what they'd always wanted. An accountant who had spent 20 years in corporate and finally walked out. A nurse who had sewn her own scrubs for years because nothing fit right. A woman named Constance, 62 years old, just retired, who sat in the front row and took the most meticulous notes I had ever seen, and said on that first day, "I have waited 37 years for this class. Nobody better give me any trouble." There was exactly one other person near my age. His name was Donald. He was a little chubby, too. He was 23, a little older than my barely 19, and he was, like me, carrying more weight than the world wanted him to. We found each other the way people like us always find each other, not by announcing ourselves, but by recognizing something in the other person's posture. The way someone holds themselves when they've learned to anticipate where the cruelty might come from. We became fast friends. We studied together, ate together, gave each other feedback that was honest but not unkind. Donald's specialty was menswear. Mine was women's wear, and particularly the architecture of clothes for bodies the fashion industry routinely pretended didn't exist. We argued about hemlines and agreed about tailoring and complained about the same assignments and made the 2 years go faster than they should have. The environment itself was, I don't have a better word than gentle. These were not people who had time for high school cruelty. They were adults who had made a decision and were living it. And there was a kind of mutual respect in that room that I had never experienced in any classroom before. Nobody looked at me like I was a punchline. Nobody arranged themselves around me as an audience. It was just people who loved clothes, at different stages of learning how to make them, all in the same room. I nearly cried on the second day, not from sadness, but from relief, from the specific relief of belonging somewhere without having to earn it first. I kept sewing while I studied. The side gig didn't stop just because I'd crossed a state line. I had customers in New Jersey within months, through word of mouth, then through a Facebook group, then through an Instagram account I started posting on whenever I finished a piece. I photographed my work on a mannequin I found at a thrift store and against the white wall of Mrs. Adebayo's hallway. The comments were small at first. Then they grew. I also networked with a seriousness that I wore like armor. I introduced myself to every instructor's visiting contact. I went to every open event that didn't require enrollment. I walked into small boutiques and left my card. A card I had designed and printed myself because of course I had. I was building a web, slowly, methodically, with the patience of someone who had been counting days for years and knew how to wait. I graduated on a Saturday in May. Donald and I took pictures outside the building and then went to a diner for breakfast and split a stack of pancakes and toasted with orange juice and didn't say anything heavy about it because the lightness was the whole point. The jobs didn't come. Not right away. Not the way I'd hoped. I applied to houses in the city, to mid-level brands, to boutique studios, to any design-adjacent position that would have me. I got a few interviews, a few second looks, and then the particular silence that means not quite. The industry was hard to crack, and I was unknown, and the truth is that what I was designing, elevated, architectural, deeply considered pieces for fuller bodies, was still, in those early years, considered niche at best and uncommercial at worst. The fashion industry was not yet ready to say out loud what we who lived in those bodies had always known, that we existed, that we had money, that we wanted beauty too. So I pivoted. I opened a TikTok account. This was not a grand strategy. It was a Saturday afternoon decision, honestly, born out of frustration and boredom and the knowledge that I had finished pieces sitting in my apartment that deserved to be seen by more than my Instagram followers. I filmed myself working. Not a polished reel, not a carefully lit promotional piece. Just me at my cutting table, explaining why I was making this seam decision, why this dart placement mattered, what I was trying to do with the drape of this sleeve. Me talking to the camera the same way I would talk to Donald over lunch. The first video got 300 views, the second got 2,000, the third got 40,000. I filmed in my kitchen. I filmed in my bedroom. I answered comments at midnight. I showed the drafts and the mistakes and the moments when the fabric did exactly what I had imagined and the moments when it fought me. I showed the finished pieces on myself sometimes and on the mannequin, and once on a neighbor who had agreed to model for me, and her name was Keisha, and she cried on camera when she put on the dress I had made for her because it fit, because it was made for her, because it did not pretend her body was a problem to be solved. That video got 3 million views. After that, the customers were not one at a time. I hired 2 part-time sewists. I ran a wait list. I turned down projects that didn't align with what I was building. I said no to things that would have paid me fine but paid me smaller than I was. I understood by then that my work had a specific gravity, a specific weight, and I mean that in the best way, and I was not interested in diluting it. That's when John Baptiste found me. John was an up-and-coming designer, Black, based between New York and Paris, with a specialty that the industry was just beginning to catch up to. Luxury fashion for plus-sized women. Not clothes that accommodated, clothes that celebrated, clothes that understood the body they were on and worked with it. His aesthetic was structured and powerful and unapologetically gorgeous, and when he sent me a DM on TikTok at 11:30 on a Tuesday night, I sat up in bed and read it 3 times. "Your work is extraordinary. I've been watching your channel for months. I want to meet." We met the following week. We talked for 4 hours. He offered me a design position. He also said something that I had not expected, that I needed a moment to absorb. He wanted me to model some of the pieces too. He said, with a matter-of-factness that was the kindest thing anyone had ever been matter-of-fact about, that I had a face and a presence and a way of wearing clothes that made other women understand what was possible, that I made the clothes make sense. I thought about the word pretty. I thought about it placed after a but in every sentence it had ever appeared in for the entirety of my childhood. I thought about what it meant to have someone receive it as a complete sentence. I said yes. 10 years is both a long time and not very long at all. 10 years of New York winters and Paris summers and fabric that cost more per yard than my high school prom dress had cost entire. 10 years of shows and fittings and the particular exhaustion of building something from nothing, and the particular satisfaction of watching it stand. 10 years of being in rooms where nobody made a joke at my expense, where the size of my body was information and not insult, where what I brought to a garment was valued above almost everything else. John Baptiste's label grew, and I grew with it. My name appeared in credits, then in features, then in the kind of profiles and the kind of publications that my mother tore out and kept in a folder that she showed to everyone at church. Mom called me every Sunday. Dad had stopped saying anything about career paths around year 3. Jerry had sent me a text when one of my pieces appeared in a magazine that I had read in my teenage bedroom with the same longing other girls read about celebrities. The text said congrats, no punctuation, but I took it. Deja and I still talked. She had become a nurse, was married, had a son named Michael, and every time she called me, she started with, "I knew it, I always knew it," and I believed her because she was the only person who had known it when knowing it required something. When the show came to Miami, I didn't announce it to my family in advance. That was a choice. John Baptiste's label had grown to the point where a touring showcase made sense, 6 cities, a month-long run, and Miami was on the list because Miami had money, and Miami had bodies, and Miami had a fashion appetite that had always been underserved by the high-end market. I was on the design team. I was also on the runway. 3 of my pieces were in the show. I arranged the tickets myself. I sent them, good seats close to the runway, to my parents with a note that just said, "Come see what the little side gig became." I sent one to my brother. I did not send one to Beth Callahan, but I didn't have to. Miami is small in the ways that matter, and the show was covered by local press, and some things take care of themselves. The night of the show, I was backstage for most of it, the way you are when you're also responsible for the clothes. I helped with a zipper. I smoothed a lapel. I watched models who looked like me, like the women I had drawn in my sketchbook at 16, at 14, at 11, all the versions of women the industry had spent decades pretending were invisible, walk out onto that runway in clothes that I had helped build from an idea to a pattern to a finished piece, and the sound of that audience was the sound of acknowledgement. of arrival. Then it was my turn. I had worn my own designs before, many times on camera, in fittings, in the small private satisfactions of a Tuesday morning when a jacket came out exactly as intended. But this was a runway, and this was Miami, and there were people in those seats who had known me as the girl who couldn't finish a lap. I walked out in a long, sweeping dress in deep sapphire, fitted through the torso, falling all the way to the floor in one clean, uninterrupted line. My hair was up. My back was straight. The shoes were 3 inches, and I had practiced for 2 weeks. The lights were very bright, and the audience was a blur of shapes and sounds, and somewhere in that blur were Mom and Dad, and I heard my mother. I know this is impossible. The room was loud, but I heard her exhale. Afterward, at the reception, a woman came up to me in a black cocktail dress and said, "You were incredible. Do you remember me? I'm Beth Callahan. We went to school together." I looked at her. I took a breath. I had practiced not for this exact conversation, but for whatever version of it this life might eventually produce. "I remember," I said. "It was Beth, the bully from high school." She smiled. It had a different quality than the smiles I remembered, a little smaller, a little more careful. "You've done so well. We always knew you had something special." "We," I noted the we. "Thank you," I said, and I turned to the next person who wanted to speak to me, to a well-known fashionista, because there were many, and because I had decided years ago, not that night, not at the reception, but during one specific 880-yard walk that I had finished, even when it broke me, even when everyone watched, that I would not spend more time than necessary on people who had only shown up after the lights came on. Beth stayed where she was for just a beat too long, waiting for me to turn back, to add something warmer, to make it easier for her. I didn't have that in me. Not for her. Not that night. She got the message the way people always get messages they don't want, slowly and then all at once. Her heels clicked once, twice, and faded into the noise of the room. I flew back to New York 2 days later. Window seat, sunrise, coffee that was only okay, but felt like a reward. The city came into view from above, gridded and silver and relentless, and mine. I thought about Maya at 16 with her calculator and her escape fund and her secondhand sewing machine and her sketchbook full of dresses nobody had asked her to design yet. I thought about the bench at the edge of the field and the girl who sat there and didn't cry, and what she was already, even then, even in the worst of it, already building. The dress she put on for graduation, the bus to New York City, the video that got 3 million views. The runway in her own city. She always had a pretty face. She also had everything else. The talent, the discipline, the patience of someone who had been counting down since 10th grade. She had not lost the weight. She had not made herself smaller to fit the space they assigned her. She had simply outgrown the room entirely and built a better one.
I developed this story and I used AI to do the narration. If you enjoyed this story, I would really appreciate it if you clicked like and subscribe. Thank you.